The presence chamber at Wenlock Palace had fallen so quiet that Isabel could hear the candle flames working, that faint, dry hum 100 wicks make when a room of 300 people forgets to breathe. She stood just inside the gilded doors in a gown of plain dove gray, and at the hollow of her throat lay a rope of pearls. The whole court knew on sight. Every woman in that chamber had seen those pearls before. They had hung at the throat of a queen, now 11 months in her tomb. A fan snapped shut somewhere to her left. A man near the dais leaned to murmur into the ear of the woman beside him, and the woman did not trouble to lower her voice when she answered the king's new favorite. She said, as though naming a dish at supper, "Wearing the dead queen's pearls to the dead queen's husband's court." The audacity of the creature. Isabel did not turn her head. She had learned, in 11 months, what it cost to turn her head. She kept her eyes on the long carpet that ran from the doors to the throne, and she counted, as she had counted before every performance of her life, the slow, even count that steadied the hands. 1, 2. The pearls were warm against her skin. They had been warm in her palm the night a dying woman closed Isabel's fingers around them and said, "You will know when, and not before." What the court believed it was watching was a scandal. What Isabel was actually doing no one in that chamber yet understood, and she could not tell them, because the moment she opened her mouth, the only proof she carried would be worth nothing at all. So she walked. She walked the length of the carpet, under 300 stairs. And she did not hurry, and she did not slow. And the pearls lay at her throat like an accusation she had chosen to wear in plain sight. Near the windows, a tall man in a black coat watched her come, and his face was the only face in the room that did not move. He did not whisper. He did not lean to a neighbor. He simply watched her the way a man watches a fire he has not yet decided whether to put out. And Isabel, who had trained half her life to read a room from the inside of a candlelit gallery, felt the weight of that particular attention settle on her like a hand. She did not yet know his name. By the end of the season, she would know it better than her own. Stay with me a moment, because to understand why a harpist wore a queen's pearls into the lion's mouth, you have to go back to the spring before, to a sick room and a promise, and to the woman who made it impossible for Isabel to ever explain herself. Isabel Quenby had come to court, the way most people of no fortune came to it. Sideways and by use, she played the harp. She played it the way her father had taught her in a cold parlor in a cathedral town, the way that made strangers stop talking. And it was that and nothing finer that had carried her from a music master's back room to the private apartments of the Queen. Queen Estrith had a weak heart and could not dance, and so on the long evenings when the court below her windows turned and glittered, the Queen had sent for the gray-eyed girl who played, and had Isabel play for hours, while the two of them said almost nothing at all. They were not friends. A queen and a hired harpist could not be friends, and both of them knew the shape of the line too well to pretend otherwise. Yet across 2 winters something had grown in that quiet room that had no name the court would have recognized. The Queen, who was surrounded at every hour by people who wanted things from her, had found one person in her household who wanted nothing but to be allowed to play. And Isabel, who had grown up watching her father bow and scrape for patrons who forgot his name between concerts, had found a woman who listened to the music as though it were the only true thing in the palace. So when the Queen began to die, slowly and then quickly, it was Isabel she sent for in the last week, and not the great ladies who hovered in the antechamber in their borrowed grief. The sick room had smelled of beeswax and the bitter tea the physicians brewed. The Queen had been a small woman made smaller, propped on pillows the color of cream, and her hands on the coverlet had been very thin. She had asked Isabel to play something without sorrow in it, and Isabel had played a country air her father loved. And when it was done, the Queen had reached beneath her pillow and brought out the pearls. "You will think it is a gift," the Queen had said. Her voice the threat it had become. "It is not a gift. It is a charge. There is a child of mine, not of my blood but of my heart, And when I am gone, there are those in this house who will strip her to the bone and smile while they do it. The proof of what is hers is sown where they will never think to cut. Wear these when the wolves are sure of themselves, not before, when they are certain they have won. Walk into the room wearing my pearls, and they will have to look at you, and once they look, they cannot unsee. You will know the hour. Promise me you will not waste it on your own good name." Isabel had promised. She had not fully understood. And the queen had not let her ask, because asking took breath the queen no longer had to spend. 3 days later, the bells rang across the city, and the queen was gone, and Isabel was a harpist holding a dead woman's pearls, and a charge she had no notion yet how to keep. What she had understood, even then, was the part about her own good name. The queen had known her court. She had known that the moment Isabel wore those pearls, the simplest story the world could tell about a plain young woman in a great man's house would be the story it reached for first, and that was precisely the story that had begun to spread through Wenlock Palace before the queen was a month in the ground. The woman who built it was Lady Berenice Vexley, and she was not a fool, which was the whole trouble. Lady Vexley was mistress of the robes, which meant she had governed the queen's wardrobe, the queen's jewels, the queen's daily small mercies of cloth and comfort for 2 decades. She had a long, handsome face, and a voice that could make a kindness sound like a sentence, and she had spent 20 years being indispensable to a woman who was now dead. Indispensability, Isabel would come to learn, is a habit that does not die with its object. It looks at once for something new to govern. What Lady Vexley meant to govern was the queen's estate. Queen Estrith had brought into her marriage a private fortune of her own, lands and rents settled on her separately, and the disposition of that fortune after her death was a knot that the lawyers had been picking at for 11 months. Most of the court assumed the money would fold quietly back into the crown. Lady Vexley assumed differently, because Lady Vexley had spent 20 years learning where the queen kept things, and she had a steward in her interest, and between them they meant to see the bulk of that private fortune settled on the persons the queen would least have chosen. There was at the heart of it a girl. Audley Brevard was 19 years old, the daughter of a gentlewoman the queen had loved in her own girlhood, orphaned at 12, and taken into the queen's particular protection. The queen had meant to provide for her. Everyone at court knew the queen had meant to provide for her. Yet the provision had been made in the queen's last months, in documents the queen had kept close, and in the confusion after the death those documents had not been found, and Lady Vexley had been remarkably untroubled by their absence. "A will that cannot be found," she had observed to her steward, "is in the end no different from a will that was never written." So the wolves were sure of themselves. That was the hour the queen had spoken of, and Isabel, watching from the edges of a court that had no use for her now that her patroness was dead, saw it coming and could not yet see what she could do to stop it. The man at the window was the queen's brother. Lysander, Marquess of Renmore, had been abroad when his sister died on the king's business in a cold northern court, and he had come home to a grave already closed, and a household already rearranging itself around the absence of the only person he had loved, without complication. He was 8 years younger than the queen had been, dark-haired and grave, a man who had learned in a hard school to keep his face shut, and he had loved his sister with the fierce, unspoken devotion of a younger brother who had spent a childhood being protected by her, and a manhood being unable to protect her in return. He had not been able to say goodbye. He had come home to find the court already telling stories about her household, and the worst of those stories had a gray-eyed harpist at its center, wearing his sister's pearls. He had made inquiries, in the careful way of a man who trusted no one's account but his own. He had been told that a music master's daughter, a person of no family, had wormed her way into the late queen's private confidence in her final illness, and that this same young woman now appeared at court, draped in the dead queen's jewels, and was whispered to be the king's new comfort. Lysander had heard this, and his face had done the thing it did, which was nothing at all, and inside the stillness something had gone very cold. He did not believe the king had a mistress. He knew the king, a decent, dull, grieving man who wanted nothing in the world but his wife back, and the slander against the king angered Lysander on the king's behalf. The pearls, however, were real. He had seen them at his sister's throat 100 times. They were his family's pearls, brought to the marriage by his sister. The one thing of their mother's she had carried into that great house, and the sight of them on a stranger struck Lysander as a desecration he could not let stand. Whatever the truth of the king, the truth of the pearls plain. They were not this woman's to wear. So he set himself to get them back and to put the woman who wore them out of the court for good, and he did it the way he did everything, thoroughly. This was the part the court never saw, and it mattered, because he was not a man defeated by his own laziness. Lysander went first to the law. He had his sister's affairs gone over by a man he trusted, and he established beyond the reach of argument that the pearls had been a personal possession of the queen with no provision made for them in any document anyone could produce, and that as her nearest blood relation he had the better claim to them by far than any servant. He gathered the household. He spoke to the dressers and the footman and the steward, and he assembled in a folio he kept close a record of testimony that the harpist had been alone with the queen in her last days, that the pearls had not been seen since, and that the woman now wore them in open court. He went to the mistress of the robes, who governed the queen's jewels and would surely support his claim, and Lady Vexley received him with grave sympathy, and told him everything he wished to hear, and offered her own steward as a witness. And Lysander, who trusted no one, very nearly trusted her, because she was telling him a story that fit every fact he had. He did not know that the woman helping him build his case against Isabel was the very wolf the queen had armed Isabel against. He thought he was avenging his sister. He was, without knowing it, doing the work of the person who meant to rob his sister's child. That was the cruelty of the thing the queen had foreseen. The honest grief of an honest man can be aimed like a weapon by someone who understands grief and means none of it. The first time Lysander spoke to Isabel directly, it was in a corridor between the music room and the great gallery, in the gray light of a wet afternoon, and he did not raise his voice once. She had been crossing to the music room with her hands full of sheets when he stepped from a doorway and said her name. Not as a question, Miss Quenby. She had stopped. She had known who he was. The whole court had marked the queen's brother's return, and she had felt his eyes on her across the gilded chamber, and known what they meant. She had been waiting, in the cold part of herself that did the waiting, for him to come. "You are wearing pearls that belong to my sister," he said. His voice was low and very level, the voice of a man who has decided to be reasonable, as an act of discipline. "I do not know what you were promised, or by whom, or what hold you imagine they give you in this house. I am telling you, once, and as a courtesy, that I will have them returned, and that you will be gone from this court before the season turns. You may give them up quietly, to me this afternoon, and I will see that no charge is laid, or you may keep them, and discover what the law does to a servant who strips a dying woman." Isabel had stood very still in the gray light. The sheets had been heavy in her arms. She had wanted, with a force that frightened her, to tell him everything, to say, "Your sister put these in my hands. She made me promise. There is a child, there is a will. They will rob her and they will use you to do it." She had opened her mouth, and she had seen in the half-second before she spoke exactly what would happen. He would ask for proof. She had none she could show. The proof was hidden where they would never look, the queen had said, and Isabel did not yet know where that was. Only that to claim it now, with nothing in her hands, was to spring the trap a season too early, and lose the child everything. So she said the only thing she could say, which was almost nothing. "I cannot give them up," she said. "Not to you. Not yet. I am sorry. I know how this looks." And she had watched his face take that in, watched the small tightening at the jaw, and understood that she had just confirmed for him every ugly thing he had been told. He had looked at her for a long moment. "Then you have chosen," he said, and turned, and walked away down the gallery. and Isabel had stood in the wet gray light, with her arms full of music, and her good name gone, and had not let herself weep, until the music-room door was shut behind her. She did not waste the weeping long. The Queen had not chosen a fool. If the proof was sewn where they would never think to cut, then it was sewn into something. And the something had to be a thing the Queen had given her or kept near her, or left in a place Isabel could reach. Isabel began, quietly, to think. The court, meanwhile, did what courts do. The story grew teeth. Lady Vexley saw to that, with the lightest possible touch. A word here, a raised brow there, never a sentence that could be traced to her. She had her own reasons to want the harpist gone, and she had the Marquis doing her demolition for her, and she fed his certainty with the patience of a woman who has all the time in the world. She arranged, with great delicacy, for Isabel to be excluded from the rooms where she might once have been heard. She arranged for the housekeeper to find fault with her. She arranged, above all, that whenever the Marquis inquired, every answer pointed the same way. It was Mrs. Cosgrove who first gave Isabel something to hold. Mrs. Drede. Cosgrove had been the Queen's underdresser for 30 years. A stout, silent woman whom Lady Vexley had pensioned off the week after the funeral, and who had stayed on in the city out of nothing but love and habit. Isabel found her in the kitchen court one cold morning, and the two of them fell to talking, as women who have lost the same person sometimes do, and Mrs. Cosgrove, dabbing her eyes, said a thing that lodged in Isabel like a splinter. She was forever at her needle that last year, Mrs. Cosgrove said. The Queen could not be still. Sewed and unpicked and sewed again the same little case for her pearls over and over, lining it and relining it, and would let none of us touch it. I thought it was the illness that wants to keep the hands busy. I never thought aught of it. The little case for her pearls. Isabel had the case. It had come into her hands with the pearls themselves. A soft folded thing of gray-watered silk, and she had thought nothing of it, but that it was where the pearls were kept. She had carried it 11 months without once cutting into it, because one does not cut apart a dead queen's needlework on a guess. The Queen, though, had told her, sewn where they will never think to cut, and the Queen had spent her last year sewing and unpicking the lining of a pearl case, while her dressers thought it was the restlessness of the dying. That night, by a single candle, Isabel turned the gray silk case in her hands, until she found the seam that did not match the others, a row of stitches a shade tighter than the rest, and she took her smallest scissors and opened it. Folded into the lining, thin as a pressed flower, was a single sheet of paper covered close in the Queen's own hand, witnessed and signed and sealed, a codicil to a will, settling the whole of the Queen's private fortune upon Ottilie Brevard, with the Marquis of Renmore named as her guardian and trustee, and a line at the foot, in the Queen's failing script, "My brother will not believe the bearer of this until he sees my hand. Lysander, it is true. Protect the girl." Isabel sat a long time with the paper in her lap. The thieves believed they had already won. The hour had come. She did not, however, run to the Marquis with it, and you should understand why, because it is the hinge on which everything turned. She had learned the court now. She knew that if she brought this paper privately to Lysander, the very man she most needed to convince was the man most prepared to believe she had forged it. She knew that Lady Vexley, the instant she learned the codicil existed, would move to have it suppressed, challenged, lost the way the original had been lost, and that a single sheet of paper in the hands of a disgraced harpist could vanish between one night and the next. The Queen had told her how to do this. Walk into the room wearing my pearls, when they are certain they have won, and they will have to look at you. The proof had to be claimed, in the open, in front of the whole court, in front of the king, where it could not be quietly made to disappear. It had to be claimed at the one event Lady Vexley had been working toward for 11 months. That event was the settlement audience. The king had at last appointed a day to hear the disposition of his late wife's private estate in the presence chamber, before the assembled court, and the lawyers had given out that in the absence of any later instrument the fortune would be divided as the mistress of the robes and the late Queen's steward advised, which was to say, away from a friendless girl and into the keeping of those who had governed the queen's purse and life, Ottilie Brevard was to be granted a small annuity, and her gratitude expected. Lady Vexley was to have charge of the rest, in trust, she said, for charitable works the queen had favored. It was as clean a theft as the law allowed, and it was to be sealed the king's hand in 3 days. Isabel made her plan, and it was a frightening plan, because it required her to be, for 3 more days, exactly the woman the court believed her to be. She let them think it. She let Lady Vexley believe the harpist was beaten, and would slink away before the audience rather than face the law the Marquess had readied. She let Lysander believe she had chosen her disgrace. She sewed the codicil back into the gray silk lining with her own hand, because the safest place in the world for it was the place no one would think to cut. And she waited. There was one moment in those 3 days when she nearly broke. It was the night before the audience, and she was crossing the empty long gallery, and she came upon the Marquess, alone at the window where she had first seen him, looking out at the dark garden, and he did not hear her until she was close. He turned. For a moment, before he remembered who she was, his face was simply the face of a man grieving his sister. Open and unguarded and terribly young, and Isabel saw it, and saw what the court had aimed at this man, and the wrong of it rose in her throat like a tide. "Tomorrow you will think the worst of me," she said before she could stop herself. She had not meant to speak. "I am asking you only this. When it comes, look at me. Whatever you have been told, look at me, and look at your sister's hand. And decide for yourself." He had gone very still. "My sister's hand," he said. "You loved her," Isabel said. "The whole court played at grieving her. You loved her. I saw it in the presence chamber. You were the only one who was not performing. That is the only reason I am saying this to you at all. Look at me tomorrow, that is all I ask." And then, because she had said far too much and the saying of it terrified her, she went, quickly, before he could call her back, and the Marquess stood at the window a long time after she had gone, turning her words in the dark, and what moved in him then he did not have a name for and would not, until the following day. The presence chamber on the day of the audience was the fullest Isabel had ever seen it. The whole court had come to watch the late queen's fortune disposed of, and a good half of them had come truthfully to watch the harpist disgraced, because that was the better entertainment. The king sat on the dais, gray and tired and dutiful. A man performing the last administrative kindness to a wife he still mourned. Lady Vexley stood near him in deep mourning, purple, grave, and composed. The very picture of a faithful servant discharging a sad duty. Her steward, Sir Aldhelm Mortlake, stood at her side with the papers. And Lysander stood apart, near the windows, in his black coat, with his folio of testimony in his hand. The case he had built to strip the harpist and avenge his sister. Not knowing the two things were opposite, the lawyers read. They read the inventory of the Queen's private estate, the lands, the rents, the sum of it, which was very great. They read that no later instrument had been found. They read that, in its absence, the disposition would proceed as advised, the small annuity to Miss Brevard, the remainder in trust to the keeping of Lady Vexley. The king lifted his pen. Lady Vexley let her eyes close for a moment, as a woman does at the end of a long, faithful labor. Ottilie Brevard, a slight pale girl by the wall, looked at the floor and did not understand yet that she had just been robbed. Isabel walked into the room wearing the pearls. She had timed it to the pen. She came through the gilded doors in the dove-gray gown, with the rope of pearls warm at her throat, and the murmur went through the chamber like wind through wheat, the king's mistress, the audacity, and she did not stop, and she did not hurry. She walked the long carpet to the foot of the dais, and she sank into the deep curtsy, owed a king. And into the silence that her arrival had made, she spoke. "Your Majesty," she said, "before you set your hand to that, I beg you to hear me, because there is a later instrument, and I have it, and I have had it 11 months. By the late Queen's own command, the chamber broke into noise." Lady Vexley's voice cut across it, smooth and quick. "Your Majesty, this is the woman herself, the very person who stripped the Queen as she lay dying. Come now to insult the proceeding with some forgery she has cooked in her disgrace. I beg you, have her removed. She has the Queen's pearls about her neck," Sir Mortlake added. "Stolen goods worn into the royal presence. There is your character, plain for all to see." The king looked tired and uncertain, and his hand hovered over the pen, and Isabel felt the whole thing tipping toward the smooth voice and the readied papers, exactly as the Queen had warned her it would. And she turned deliberately away from the king, and she looked at the man at the windows, and she said, into the noise, "You asked me once how this looked. Look now." And Lysander looked. He had crossed half the room without deciding to. He stood now at the foot of the dais, near enough to see her face, and he looked at her, and then he looked at the pearls, his sister's pearls, his mother's pearls at the throat of the woman the whole court had taught him to despise, and something in his certainty cracked because she was not looking at him the way a guilty woman looks. She was looking at him the way his sister used to, steady and unafraid and asking him to be better than the room. "What instrument?" he said. His voice was low, and it carried. "What later instrument?" "The codicil to the will," Isabel said, holding his eyes. "In the Queen's own hand, witnessed and sealed, settling her whole private fortune upon her goddaughter, Ottilie Brevard, and naming you, my lord, as the girl's guardian and trustee. She sewed it into the lining of the pearl case with her own hands in the last year of her life, because she knew the people in this room who would make a will disappear. And she gave the pearls and the case into my keeping and made me promise to claim it in the open before the whole court on the day they were certain they had won. This is that day. They were certain. Here I am." "You can produce this instrument," Lysander said. The room had gone utterly silent now. "I can," Isabel said. And then, because the Queen had foreseen even this, she added a thing she had been keeping. "My lord, it bears a line your sister wrote. For you alone, she wrote that you would not believe the bearer until you saw her hand. She wrote, 'Lysander, it is true. Protect the girl.' Those are her words, not mine. I could not have known to write them. You knew her hand and her heart. Read it, and tell this court whether a harpist forged that." Lady Vexley moved then, fast, the composure breaking at the edges. "Your Majesty, there is no need to dignify. The case has not been examined. Anyone may sew a paper into a lining and claim a queen wrote it." "Then let it be examined," Lysander said. And he did not look at her when he said it. And that was the moment, though Lady Vexley did not yet know it, that she lost. Because the Marquis had built his whole case on her counsel, had trusted her account against his own instinct, and now he heard her, for the first time, fighting to keep a thing from being looked at. A truthful witness asks for the light. He had spent 2 months mistaking a person who feared the light for a person who loved his sister. The pearl case was sent for. Isabel had left it in the music room, in plain view, and a footman brought it, the soft folded gray silk, and Isabel took her own small scissors from her reticule, and in front of the king and the court, she knelt and opened the seam she had sewn 3 nights before, the seam a shade tighter than the rest. And she drew out the thin folded sheet and held it up, and then she did the thing that mattered most. She did not give it to the king. She did not give it to a lawyer. She rose and she carried it across the silence, and she put it into the hands of the Marquess of Renmore, his sister's brother, the man named in it to protect the girl, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "She trusted you to keep it." "So do I." Lysander unfolded the paper. The whole chamber watched him read. They watched a grave, dark man in a black coat read 3 lines in a dead woman's failing hand, and they watched his throat move, and they watched him put one hand briefly to his mouth, the only unguarded thing that Hardface had done in the sight of the court since he came home. And when he lowered the paper, his eyes were wet, and his voice when it came was perfectly steady. "This is my sister's hand," he said. "I would know it among 10,000. This is the Queen's later instrument, witnessed and sealed. and it leaves her fortune to her goddaughter and charges me to protect her." He turned to the king. "Your Majesty, the disposition you were about to seal is contrary to the late Queen's express and proven will. I ask that it be stayed." The king took the paper. The king read it, and his tired, grave face changed, because he too had known his wife's hand, and he too had loved her, and he had nearly, in his grief and his weariness, set his name to a theft. He looked up, and he looked for a long moment at the harpist the court had been so eager to call his mistress. And what was in his face was not desire, and never had been. It was something closer to shame that this woman had carried his wife's truth for 11 months, while his court abused her for it, and had asked nothing, and had borne it. "Lady Vexley," the king said, and his voice was quiet. And it was terrible, because it was quiet. "You governed my wife's jewels, and her purse, and her trust for 20 years. You told my court that this woman was a thief, and you told this gentleman that his sister's pearls had been stolen, and you stood in this room a moment ago and asked me to seal her fortune away from the child she loved. Knowing, I think that you did." The king let the silence work. "You will give up your office," he said, "and you will retire from this court, and you will count yourself fortunate that the woman you wronged has asked me for nothing, because had she asked, I would have given it. Go." There was no shouting. There was no triumph. Lady Vexley stood for a moment, with her long, handsome face gone white and still. And then she understood that the room she had governed for 20 years had finished with her. And she sank into a curtsy to the king, because even now the habit held, and she went out through the gilded doors. And the court did not part for her so much as fail to notice her go, which is the cruelest thing a court can do, and the only justice the Queen would have wanted. Sir Mortlake had already gathered his papers and made himself small. The wolves had been so certain. That was what had undone them. Audley Brevard was weeping by the wall, a girl who had walked into the room an hour earlier expecting to be told to be grateful for crumbs, and now stood the heir to a queen's fortune. And Isabel went to her, because that was the charge. That had always been the charge, and put her arms around the girl while the court rearranged its opinions. And Audley said into Isabel's shoulder, "I never knew. She never told me. Why did you not tell me?" And Isabel said, "Because I could not keep you safe and tell you both. Now you are safe. Now I can tell you everything." She had not, in all of it, spoken a word for herself. It was Lysander who did that. When the audience had broken up and the chamber emptied, he came to her, and he stood before her with his sister's pearls between them, and his face was no longer shut. "I owe you," he said, and stopped, because the account was too large to name. "I came to this court certain you were the worst kind of woman. I built a case against you with my own hands. I gave you in the gallery the cruelest choice I knew how to give, and you took it, and you took the whole season's contempt with it, rather than spring my sister's trap a day too early." He shook his head slowly. "You let me believe the worst of you to keep a promise to a dead woman who could no longer thank you. There is a word for that. And it is not the word the court used. You asked me to look at you," he said, "and I would not, until you made me. I am looking now, Miss Gwenby. I find I cannot stop." Isabel, who had been the still center of 100 performances, found that her hands were not steady at all. They did not marry that season, because the season was for mourning and for setting the Queen's house in order. And Lysander did both, with a thoroughness. Isabel came to love in him. The same thoroughness he had once turned against her now turned wholly to her keeping and to the girl's. He took up his trusteeship of Audley's fortune and rendered such an account of every shilling that no Lady Vexley could ever again come near it. He restored Mrs. Firksty Cosgrove to a place of honor in the household, with a pension that was a pension and not an insult, because Mrs. Cosgrove's love and habit had saved them all. And in the long blue evenings, he came more and more to wherever Isabel was playing, and stood at the edge of the candlelight the way his sister had once sat in it, listened to the music as though it were the only true thing in the palace. He called her by her given name for the first time on an autumn evening in the music-room, when the court was elsewhere and the fire had burned low. "Isabel," he said, and she looked up from the strings, and he was standing where the Marquis had stood at the window the night before the audience. Only his face was open now, and had been open to her for weeks. "I have spent my life unable to protect the people I loved. My sister protected me, and died, and I could not save her. I told myself I would at least avenge her, and I nearly destroyed the one person who was keeping her last wish." He crossed the room. "I do not want to make that error twice. I would like, if you will allow it, to spend the rest of my life looking at you. Plainly, in front of anyone. As my wife?" Isabel set the harp aside. There was a great deal she might have said, and the niche of her life had taught her to deflect, to keep her own counsel, to play rather than speak. She did none of it. "Yes," she said. The word she had wanted to say for weeks. "Yes, my lord. Yes." He took her hand, the hand that played, and he held it as though it were the thing his sister had charged him to protect, and in a way it was. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the chapel where the Queen was buried, which Isabel had asked for, and Lysander had understood without needing it explained. Ottilie stood up with her. A young woman of fortune, now with a future the Queen had reached out of her own death to give her. The king came and stood at the back, and at the end he came forward and took Isabel's hand and said low, so that only she heard, "My wife chose well in you. I am sorry it took my whole court a year to see it." And Isabel, who had carried that court's contempt for 11 months without complaint, found she had no anger left to spend, only the strange peace of a charge discharged, the pearls she did not keep. On the morning of the wedding she went to the chapel early, before the others, and knelt at the Queen's tomb, and she took the rope of pearls from her own throat and laid them on the cold stone, because they had never been hers, and the Queen had never meant them to be, only lent for an hour that had stretched to a year. Lysander, who had followed her without her hearing, knelt beside her and took them up again, and clasped them once more about her neck with his own hands. "She would have wanted you to have them now," he said. "Not as a charge. The first true gift my sister has been able to give in a year, and she gave it through you, and I will not let you put it down." So Isabel wore the late Queen's pearls again on the day she was married, and this time no voice in any room called her anything but by her name. The music room at Renmore stood at the west of the house, where the autumn light came in long and gold across the floor, in the late afternoon, and it was there, a year on, that you would have found her. She kept the gray silk pearl case on the small table by the window, the seam she had cut now, sewn shut again with her own neat stitches, empty of its old burden, kept only because the Queen's hands had made it. Ottilie came often, and Mrs. Cosgrove sat by the fire with her mending, and on the evenings when the Marquess came home from the business of the estate, he would stop in the doorway before either of them spoke, and listen to the harp, and Isabel would feel him there before she saw him. The weight of that particular attention she had felt the very first day under 300 stairs, only warm. Now, and hers. She played most evenings. She played the country air her father had taught her, and the Queen had loved, the one without sorrow in it, and the fire would settle, and the gold light would go gray and then blue, and her husband would cross the room when the last note had faded, the way he had crossed the chamber that day, at the foot of the dais, and put his hand over her hand, on the strings, and the house would be quiet, and she would be seen. If this story has stayed with you, sit a moment longer with the woman who carried a truth. No one would let her tell, and remember that the quietest person in the room is so often the one holding everything together. It was a kindness to stay with her to the last, and she was worth the staying.